Bonanza 46 Romeo, GOS?
Affirm, GOS 46 Romeo.
Gotcha. Alaska 226, San Jose Tower, running 12 left, clear for takeoff.
12 left, clear for takeoff, Alaska 226. And what was that landing on 12 right?
That's a Vision Jet.
Vision Jet. Cool. Single engine?
Yep.
Wow.
Vision Jet 2 Tango Sierra, turn right at Golf, contact ground, 0.7.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 91 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use. Today, we're talking about how to fly IFR Arrival Procedures, also known as STARS, and I'll share my observations about issues with arrival procedures that I saw while flying with a couple of different pilots in Cirrus Vision Jets last weekend. Plus, this week in the news, the fiancé of a missing flight instructor in Colorado has been arrested for murder. An electric helicopter set a new distance record, and Love has gotten a young woman in trouble as she tried to help her boyfriend with flight lessons. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to educate and inform you and have a little fun along the way. If you're new to the show, I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, author of the G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, and these days I specialize in Cirrus aircraft like the SR-20, SR-22, and SF50 Vision Jet. So if you're starting to think about buying one of these aircraft or would like some training in one, please call me today for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 90, we talked with a pilot who passed out in flight from carbon monoxide poisoning and then survived a crash while unconscious. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. This first story is a sad one, and I wouldn't be reporting it except that it's been widely reported in aviation news sites, and there is new news in the case that hasn't been widely reported. The original story was that Colorado flight instructor Kelsey Barrett, the 29-year-old mom, has been missing since Thanksgiving Day. She was last seen at a grocery store in Woodland Park, Colorado. 3 days later, her cell phone pinged a tower about 800 miles away in Idaho, and a text message was sent from the phone to Colorado Springs Flight School, where she is an instructor, requesting time off from work. Well, abcnews.go.com reported over the weekend that Patrick Frazee, Barra's fiancé and the father of her baby daughter, was arrested Friday and charged with first-degree murder and solicitation to commit first-degree murder, police said. They no longer believe that Kelsey Barrett is alive. Details of what led police to arrest Frazee have not been disclosed. Under Colorado's solicitation statute, a suspect would have not only discussed the commission of a crime with a second person, but would have taken steps to see it through. According to District Attorney Dan May of Colorado's 4th Judicial District, our hearts go out to the family of flight instructor Kelsey Barrett. And as you probably know, there's a partial shutdown of the U.S. government that affects approximately a quarter of federal employees, including the FAA. According to the FAA.gov website, due to a lapse in funding, the FAA will only conduct exempt activities. Your traffic control is fully operational, and there is no impact to safety or FAA oversight for travelers. The low-altitude authorization and notification capability and drone zone are operational. They conclude by saying that posts to this website and social media accounts will be limited, presumably because press releases and PR are not an exempt activity. Now, one activity that's closed in past shutdowns, but which will probably remain open during this shutdown, is the FAA's aircraft registry in Oklahoma City. That's thanks to the FAA reauthorization bill that passed in September, which made aircraft registry an exempt activity. So if you're buying or selling an airplane over the holiday season, you should still be able to do the transfer paperwork you need to do through the FAA. We'll have more news about the shutdown on next week's show. From avweb.com, an electric helicopter sets a new record. A modified Robinson R-44 designed and built by Tier 1 Engineering has set a Guinness World Record for the farthest distance traveled by an electric-powered helicopter. The flight launched from the Los Alamitos Army Airfield in California and covered 30 nautical miles at an average speed of 80 knots at about 800 feet. The helicopter was flown by Captain Rick Webb of OC Helicopters. Tier 1 said it is working on the project under contract with a goal to produce an electric-powered, semi-autonomous rotorcraft that will deliver manufactured organs for transplantation to hospitals with less noise and fuel consumption than current technology. The company first flew the aircraft in September 2016. Its twin electric motors are powered by 1,100 pounds of Bramo lithium polymer batteries, and it's controlled with a system from Reinhardt Motion Systems. In February 2017, the aircraft set a world record for duration and altitude of a battery-powered helicopter with a 30-minute flight reaching 800 feet and flying at a peak speed of 80 knots. The program aims to achieve 2 hours of flight time plus a 30-minute reserve. From fiercewireless.com comes a story that the aviation community worries about possible effects of 5G, that is the next technology for cell phones, in the C-band. While the FCC contemplates changes to the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, otherwise known as C-band, aviation officials want to make sure it doesn't disrupt aviation systems operating right next door in the 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz band. Representatives from a number of companies and aviation associations recently met with FCC staff to discuss their concerns. The groups are worried about the potential harmful interference to aviation systems operating in the 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz band, which includes radio altimeters. The concerns are not new. They've been voiced in previous filings, but they illustrate yet another complicated issue for the FCC to consider as it contemplates ways to make C-band spectrum available for 5G terrestrial uses. That would be for cell phones. According to the Aviation Spectrum Resources, ASR, radio altimeters are especially vital for helicopters, which have a variety of missions often involving operation at lower altitudes over uneven terrain and in a variety of environments. Boeing also noted that radio altimeters use relatively low power levels and must operate across the entire 4.2 to 4.4 megahertz bandwidth to generate accurate results for landing aircraft. Some members of the aviation industry are already working to test the potential impact of 5G signals to radio altimeter operations. Those tests were expected to be done before the end of the year, but were not complete as of the meeting that took place with the FCC last week. And here's another story about the FCC. This comes to us from AINonline.com. FCC bans certification and sale of 121.5 megahertz ELTs. In a move designed to accelerate the transition from 121.5 megahertz to 406 megahertz emergency location transmitters, or ELTs, the Federal Communications Commission last week issued a new rule prohibiting certification of new 121.5 megahertz units, but the rule continues to permit the use of existing 121.5 megahertz ELTs. The rule follows a previous rulemaking in which the FCC had prohibited the sale, certification, and use of these older ELTs. The agency, however, stayed that action after the FAA and AOPA appealed to the FCC, citing concerns about the cost of equipping with the 406 megahertz units and the belief that 121.5 megahertz still provided some benefit. The agency followed with a rule published in the December 12th Federal Register that immediately prohibits certification of new 121.5 megahertz units and prohibits the manufacture and sale of them after a 6-month transition. From avweb.com, senators call for funding of contract tower airports. 36 members of the U.S. Senate sent a bipartisan letter to the FAA urging the administration to implement a provision that would make airports using the Contract Tower Program eligible for Airport Improvement Program, or AIP grants. Now, these grants, by the way, are available to many airports on a matching basis, though I don't think airports can get them every year. They are available for major projects. It says the provision allowing AIP funding for airports with contract towers was included in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, which was signed into law in October. The FAA Contract Tower Program began in 1982 and now includes over 250 airports across the United States. And here next to my airport, the San Carlos Airport, as I recall, is one of those contract towers here in California. According to the letter, the Contract Tower Airport funding provision was marked as a priority consideration, quote, in light of the safety, financial, and other benefits that these towers provide to small airports and rural areas. From AOPA.org, a Michigan bill would limit flying club operations. A Michigan House bill that would designate flying clubs as commercial entities and limit combined takeoff and landings to 10 per day at private landing areas ran into stiff opposition from aviation advocates at the legislative hearing. AOPA Great Lakes Regional Manager Kyle Lewis noted that by lumping flying clubs into commercial operations, the bill's proposed definitions directly conflict with FAA policy and the state aeronautics code. Quote, AOPA believes that this legislation, if passed as written, will negatively impact the current operation of flying clubs and the formation of future flying clubs in the state of Michigan. He also went on to add that there are more than 500 private-use airports in Michigan. In international news, and this comes to us from Flyer magazine at flyer.co.uk, mandatory ID is being proposed for all flights in the UK, according to an aviation green paper. The UK government has just published an aviation strategy green paper outlining its long-term ambition for aviation successes after leaving the EU. According to the section on mandatory ID in the general aviation section, the government is proposing mandatory identification of all aircraft in UK airspace. This would be achieved by electronic conspicuity devices, which I think refers to ADS-B, to allow an aircraft to determine its own position and then broadcast that information to other aircraft in the vicinity and receiving stations on the ground, providing greater situational awareness. Quote, mandating such technology would mitigate the significant risks of mid-air collisions and increase the ability to regrade airspace to enable greater sharing of airspace, said the paper. Under pilot training, they also mentioned that relief from VAT, that's the value-added tax on pilot training, which has been long called for by the UK's booming commercial pilot training industry. They said, quote, any VAT or VAT exemption for pilot training would need to be implemented alongside a suitable regulatory framework for providers in order to comply with existing VAT rules for education in training. And under other points, the paper notes that continue working with EASA to develop a proportionate regulatory framework for GA and reduce burdens, including the development of the EASA GA roadmap with an aim of simpler, lighter, better regulation for GA. And finally, in a story of love gone wrong, and also just to prove that we go to the ends of the earth to find the most interesting stories for you on this show, this comes from znews.india.com. A girl in Rajkot robbed her own house to fund her boyfriend's pilot training course. The duo was studying chartered accountancy and had met at a coaching class. The girl, whose name is Priyanka, is 20 years old, stole 2.1 million Indian rupee, which is about $30,000 in the U.S., along with jewelry for her boyfriend named Het, who was 20, who wanted to become a commercial pilot. The course fee was nearly 2 million Indian rupee, or about $28,500 U.S. Priyanka used duplicated keys of cupboards and robbed her own house when her mother and sister were out of town. The couple was arrested, and all the stolen cash and jewelry have been recovered from Het's possession. He had left Rajkot and moved to Bengaluru following the robbery. Priyanka vandalized the house to make it look like a burglary. Now, I was really curious about the lady's name, Priyanka, so I looked it up on Wikipedia. It says it's a popular female given name in Hindu and Buddhist cultures. It's a name derived from the Sanskrit word Priyankara, or Priyankara, meaning someone or something that is amiable, lovable, or makes you happy. I don't think she lived up to her name this time. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, first, my weekly updates, and then we'll have our main topic about how to fly IFR arrival procedures. And later, we'll have listener feedback and questions, all here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Welcome back. In a few minutes, we'll get to our main topic about arrival procedures, but first let me give you a few quick updates. So I was lucky enough to fly the Vision Jet for 3 days in a row last weekend, which I'll talk more about in our main topic as we talk about arrivals. And you, of course, heard the recording at the beginning of this show with an Alaskan airline pilot asking what kind of jet we were. Now, I wish I'd recorded another conversation that occurred the day before when we were on an Oakland Center frequency en route to Las Vegas. Oakland Center had called us as traffic to a SkyWest jet that was en route to San Jose by telling them that we were a Vision Jet at 12 o'clock and 8 miles 1,000 feet below them, and that it probably had a shiny new coat of paint, which made us laugh. We then watched the Embraer jet fly directly overhead as it reported, Vision Jet in sight, shiny new coat of paint confirmed. So anyway, at this point, I can say there are probably only about 80 of these jets flying around anywhere in the world, and it's kind of fun to see the attention that they draw. Now, after the last landing on the third day, I received a text message from Jan Sears asking if I had just landed in a Vision Jet at San Jose. Now, you might remember our interview with Jan Sears last year in episode 37. Jan is the CHP pilot who was the first to spot the huge Tubbs wildfire that burned a large area of Northern California and killed a number of people last year. Anyway, I texted Jan back telling him yes, and he asked if he could come over to see the Vision Jet. Now, that aircraft is privately owned and stored in a private hangar. So I asked the owner for permission, and he said that Jan could come over and take a look. And it turns out that there was a football game at Levi Stadium where the San Francisco Giants play, which is just off the north end of the San Jose airport. And Jan had been flying one of CHP's Gibbs Airvans, which is similar to a Cessna Caravan, over the stadium prior to the game, and was scheduled to do that again as the game was ending. But he'd been taking a break during the game and had met up with a friend of his, Landon, who's a former Durham, North Carolina police officer who now works at a high-tech company here in Silicon Valley. So the two of them came over, and I opened up the Vision Jet so that they could sit in it and see what it was like. I turned on the batteries for about 2 minutes, and there was a lot of oohing and aahing and questions about the Garmin G3000 glass cockpit in the Vision Jet. And what was funny about our meetup was that I realized that I had never met Jan face-to-face before. Now, we've talked over the phone, exchanged lots of text and Twitter messages, and we, of course, recorded episode 37, and we've even talked aircraft to aircraft when I recognized his voice when we were both on the same NorCal frequency. When that occurred, I called him on the Victor frequency that CHP uses. He heard me and called me back, so it was pretty funny getting a chance to finally meet Jan in person along with Landon, so that was great. And let me tell you where I'll be speaking over the next couple of months. In January and again in February, I'll be giving my presentation on how to fly the San Francisco Bay Tour. Now, the Bay Tour is the way pilots have gotten around and through the San Francisco Class Bravo for at least the 30 years that I've lived here. The routes have changed somewhat because of the massive overhaul the FAA did to San Francisco's Class Bravo back in August. And as a CFI, learning how to fly the Bay Tour is the number one request I get from pilots in this area. Now, the first presentation will be on Wednesday, January 16th at the San Carlos Airport at 7 p.m. at the West Valley Flying Club. And if you can't make that presentation, then mark Wednesday, February 13th on your calendar, and that one will be at the Palo Alto Airport, also at the West Valley Flying Club. And I think that one starts at 7:30, possibly 7. And finally, I'll be giving the presentation again on March the 12th in San Martin, California, at the Wings of History Museum, which is right behind the San Martin Airport. Dinner is at 6 p.m., and I'll be speaking sometime after 7 p.m. And, of course, I'll also have my newly revised San Francisco Bay Tour maps available for sale at all of these presentations. And soon they're going to be available again in pilot shops at San Carlos and the Reed Hillview airports. Now, if you want a map but can't make it to a presentation, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact, and send me an email. And for those who've already emailed me, I'll be contacting you later this week. I'll also be giving a brief presentation on modern GA aircraft technology to the Foothill Men's Club in downtown Saratoga, California on Tuesday, January the 15th at 7 p.m. And looking forward to later in the year, I'm planning to be presenting at Sun and Fun this year for the first time in at least 6 years, so I hope that I'll meet many of you there. And of course, I will be back at AirVenture in July in Oshkosh. And this year, I'm planning to give more presentations than I gave last year, and I'll have more details for you about that in the coming months. And again, I hope to meet many of you there. And I also want to give a quick shout out and thank you to Moj Kazi. He's a software guru who over the weekend modified the aviationnewstalk.com website so that it now has SSL. Now that's important for security if you're buying and selling through a website, which I'm not doing on that website. But since August, Google has said that they are lowering the ranking when people do a Google search for websites that don't have SSL. You can tell when you go to a website, if the web address starts with HTTP, well, then they don't have SSL. But if it starts with HTTPS, then it does. So my thanks to Moj, and hopefully our website will now rank higher and more people will find the Aviation News Talk podcast when they're randomly searching Google for some aviation topic that we've discussed here in the podcast. And hey, this is just about the last week to go out and participate in our second annual listener survey. This is really your chance to provide feedback to the show and help guide us for the future. So if there's a topic you'd like to hear about that you think is important and that other pilots could benefit from, take the survey and let me know. Or maybe there's this one little thing I do each week that drives you crazy. Again, take the survey, let me know. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. And hey, after the show, if you want just a little extra aviation content, go on out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and click on posts. I post a lot of things out there between shows, some of which make it into the next show and some of which don't. And while you're there, if you feel like you get some value from this show and you're in a position to donate a few dollars a month, well, you can sign up right there on the Patreon site. I would really love to get a couple more supporters before the end of the year. So if you've been thinking about donating, well, just take a moment over the holidays to sign up. Again, that's at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And there's also a link to it in our show notes. And I do want to thank our new Patreon supporters who joined us in the last couple of weeks. They include Eric Hignite, he's back with us again, Darren Medlin, Robert Cobble, Jim Lauridson, Max Spivak, who I flew with across the country, Timothy Meyer, Jamie Gamble, and finally Chris Ostrowski, who joins our super supporters who donate $20 or more each month. And I'd like to take just a moment to thank everybody who's helped contribute in any way to the show over the last year, whether it's sending us an email, providing feedback and reviews, donating through Patreon. Really appreciate all of your support. You really are the gas that keeps this engine going. I love hearing from each and every one of you. Now in a moment, we're going to talk about how to fly IFR Arrival Procedures right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Welcome back. I was prompted to talk about arrivals today because I was lucky to have 3 straight days of flying in 2 different Cirrus Vision jets last weekend. Now, a couple of trips were to Las Vegas, and another was a round-robin flight to 3 different airports here in Northern California. The weather was excellent the first 2 days, both flying into Las Vegas. The first trip was on a Friday to North Las Vegas Airport. Second trip was to McCarran Airport, which is the big international airport in Las Vegas, and from there to Reno in Northern Nevada before returning to California. Now, we flew departure procedures and arrival procedures on almost every leg, and most of the landings were made with a visual approach. On the third day, we had rain over a wide area here in Northern California, so we flew instrument approaches into 3 different airports and landed at 2 of them. And by the way, as a side note, at a couple of the airports we visited, we were able to receive our entire IFR clearance using ForeFlight. Now, this is a new capability that was introduced earlier this year called Pre-Departure Clearance, or PDC. And on ForeFlight's website, they say it's a partnership with Satcom Direct that delivers PDC and also DATIS, which is Digital Automated Terminal Information Service. They say at the busiest airports in the U.S., and I looked it up, and currently there are a list of 76 airports. They say that once you register your aircraft and file a flight plan with ForeFlight, you'll automatically receive your full clearance and current ATIS information via email and a text message. So there's no need to call clearance delivery for your clearance, which is pretty cool, though this feature is only available with ForeFlight's Performance Plus plan, which is $299 per year, and with the business performance plans. Well, thinking about those 3 days of jet flying and observing the mistakes that I made and the other pilots on these trips made, I came to the conclusion that the arrival procedures were really where we encountered most of the difficulties, though we did have one glitch on a departure procedure. All of the instrument approaches went very well, and the visual approaches also went well with the one exception. In one case, we loaded the visual approach, which you can now load just like an instrument approach in the Vision Jet's G3000 for the left runway at an airport, and the initial starting point was to the right of both runways. Well, since we were approaching on a left base, we ended up overshooting both runways before we overrode the system and lined up properly on the left runway. Now, that's the first time I've seen any of these automated visual approaches line up poorly with the extended center line, and I'm guessing it was just a mistake in the database for the runway at that particular airport. So today I'm going to talk first about arrivals in general, and then I'll talk about the mistakes I saw. But first, before we talk about arrivals, let's briefly review the highlights of departure procedures. Way back in episode 66, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/66, we talked in detail about departure procedures, including ODPs, that's obstacle departure procedures. Those are printed either textually or graphically, and SIDs, which are standard instrument departures, also known as DPs, which are always printed graphically. Now, these are published sets of instructions designed for instrument pilots to use when departing from larger airports, and they're used to expedite the departures and to simplify clearance delivery. And that basically reduces the amount of information you have to write down, the time you're spent talking on the radio, which is a big help. Now, to fly a departure procedure or an arrival, you're going to need the published description of it, which is included with instrument approach charts. There are 2 sources for instrument charts these days. One is Jeppesen, now owned by Boeing, and in the printed JEP charts, the arrivals are grouped with the airports that they serve. Of course, the other publisher of charts is the FAA. If you buy the printed charts, you'll find the arrival procedures in the front of the book. There is a third set of charts from the Department of Defense that's primarily for military fields, and that's known as the Flight Information Program, or FLIP charts. Of course, these days, most of us get our departure and arrival charts from electronic flight bag apps like ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot. Arrivals are similar departure procedures, except they're for IFR aircraft that are arriving in an airport. Arrivals are also known as STARS, or Standard Terminal Arrival Routes. Now, a STAR is an ATC-coded IFR route for aircraft flying to a specific airport. And once a flight crew has accepted a clearance for a STAR, well, then they've communicated with the controller what the route's going to be, and in some cases, what the altitude and airspeeds are to be flown during the arrival, depending upon, and this is critical, on the type of clearance that is issued to you as you're flying the arrival. And we'll talk about the different kinds of clearances you can get as you're flying the arrival in a few minutes. Now, the structure of departure procedures is that there's usually one single bold line on the chart that leaves the airport and takes you to a fix that might be 10, 20 miles or even further away from the airport. And at that fix, the departure can split into a number of branches or transitions, and typically a pilot's clearance will include the transition that's most aligned with their direction of flight. So you can think of a departure as like a big main river leaving the airport that branches into multiple little tiny tributaries at that fix. And the name of the fix where the split occurs is the name that's used for the title of the departure procedure. Now let's take a look at a real example I flew last weekend. If we were cleared to fly the Techie 4 departure from the San Jose airport, all of the airplanes assigned this departure fly first to Techie, and then at Techie they split, and some fly the transition to eBay, and others fly the transition to Lotion. Arrivals have a similar structure to departures, except they flow in the opposite direction. So typically with an arrival, there are two or more transitions that come from different directions that will all meet up at a single fix for which the arrival is named. Beyond that fix, airplanes will typically follow just one common path to the airport, though there are some arrivals now which will split you up toward the end to feed you toward opposite ends of the same runway. Another difference between departure procedures, or DPs, and arrivals is that DPs start at the airport pavement and connect to the en route structure. However, arrivals start at the en route structure but do not make it all the way back down to the pavement. That's because arrivals serve multiple runways and sometimes multiple airports, and because ultimately they lead you to an instrument approach, which then does get pilots down to the pavement. Now, the objective when connecting a star to an instrument approach procedure is to assure a seamless lateral and vertical transition. Stars are also designed in a way so that when they connect with the instrument approach procedure, they're trying to maintain the overall descent and deceleration profiles throughout both of those procedures, both the arrival and the instrument approach. Now, stars typically include a descent gradient of about 318 feet per nautical mile, which is about 3 degrees, though the descent gradient on a star will vary, especially if you need to meet some altitude restriction that's published along the arrival procedure. In March 2016, the FAA published new design guidance for stars. Now, it was FAA Order 8260.3, and the new guidance requires a more shallow descent gradient for the last part of a star. In addition to descent gradients, stars also allow deceleration segments at any waypoint that has a speed restriction. And it's just a general guideline. Deceleration considerations will typically add about 1 nautical mile of distance for every 10 knots of speed reduction required. Now, there are also RNAV stars, and these can only be used by aircraft that are equipped with a GPS or an FMS, a flight management system. An RNAV star or star transition typically includes flyby waypoints, which means you don't go directly over them necessarily, but with flyover waypoints when needed, those will be added to a star. These waypoints may be assigned crossing altitudes and speeds, just like any other star, to optimize descent and deceleration profiles. Now, here's something I didn't know. RNAV star procedures are designated as either RNAV-1 or RNAV-2 based upon the aircraft navigation equipment required, flight crew procedures, and the process and criteria used to develop the star. Now, here's the difference. An RNAV-1 procedure requires that the aircraft's total system air remain bounded by plus and minus 1 nautical mile for 95% of the total flight time, and RNAV-2 requires a total system air of not more than 2 nautical miles for 95% of the total flight time. Now, as you might expect, RNAV-1 stars have higher equipment requirements and often tighter RNP tolerances, that's required navigation performance, than RNAV-2. Now, most GA aircraft, even those with a modern WAAS GPSs that many of us fly with, those are not permitted to fly RNP approaches. So in general, GA pilots and typical GA aircraft are not going to be flying the RNAV-1 arrivals. And by the way, you can figure out if a star is either an RNAV-1 or an RNAV-2 by looking for the designation in the notes section on the chart. Now, every RNAV departure chart and arrival includes general notes, and they may include specific equipment and performance requirements, as well as the type of RNAV departure procedure in the plan view. By the way, there are a whole lot of new aircraft equipment suffix codes for advanced RNAV navigation, but in general, for most of us flying WAAS-capable GPSs and GA aircraft, we're going to be using the slant G for GPS code. And now let's talk about the different kinds of clearances you can get on an arrival, as this is one of the points that one of the pilots I was flying with in the Vision Jet did not fully understand. We were on the arrival procedure going into McCarran Airport, and he said that since we were on the arrival that he was now cleared to descend according to the altitudes published on the arrival. I said, no, we follow the arrival, but we're restricted to our last assigned altitude. And by the way, this is a good time to mention that I noticed one clear advantage to the Jeppesen charts at this point, which he had up on the display in the Vision Jet. The chart showed the altitudes along the arrival in two different colors, black and blue. Now, every segment on the arrival has a black number, which is the MEA, or minimum en route altitude for that segment. So that number means that you have either 1,000 or 2,000 feet of obstruction clearance above the rocks below you if you were to fly at that altitude that's published in black. And on the JEP charts, some of the fixes along the arrival also have a blue number, and that number is the altitude you are cleared to descend to if you've been cleared to fly the published altitudes. Now let's talk about some examples of the kinds of clearance you might get from ATC when flying an arrival. If your clearance is just cleared for the Hadley 1 arrival, then you are to use the arrival for lateral routing, that is left and right guidance only. So if you hear that you are cleared for the arrival and you don't hear anything else, you stay at your currently assigned altitude forever, or until, of course, ATC assigns you a different altitude. Now, here's another example. If your clearance is cleared for the Hadley 1 arrival, descend and maintain flight level 240, well, then you're cleared to follow the left-right guidance of the arrival and to descend only to that assigned altitude, and then you must maintain that altitude until ATC assigns you a different altitude. Now, here's a third example. If you're cleared using the phrase descend via the Hadley 1 arrival, then you are to follow all the left-right turns of the arrival and to descend at pilot discretion to reach all the published altitudes for each fix, which would, of course, be the blue numbers on the Jeppesen charts or the arrival charts. Now, the key difference there was the phrase descend via. So if you hear the phrase descend via the Hadley 1 arrival, now you can go ahead and follow the stair steps down on your own, follow the published altitudes. And here's another example. The controller may clear you to use the arrival, but with specific exceptions. So, for example, a controller might say, descend via the Hadley 1 arrival, except cross Marvin at 13,000, then maintain 10,000. So in this case, the pilot should track the arrival both laterally and vertically, descending to comply with all the altitudes and airspeed restrictions until they reach Marvin, and then maintain 10,000 feet until cleared by ATC to descend any further. You could also be cleared to bypass all of the transitions and to fly directly to the common point for which the star is named, and then be cleared to use the star for lateral guidance and altitude restrictions for the rest of the arrival. For example, proceed direct Mayhem, descend via the Mayhem 2 arrival. That would be to clear you directly to the common point, bypassing all the transitions that lead up to Mayhem. And that is exactly what happened when we were flying last weekend from Reno to San Jose. We were cleared directly to Razor, for which the Razor 4 arrival is named, and not to any of the transitions that eventually lead up to Razor. So to load the approach, we had to use the proc key to load the Razor 4 arrival, and then it didn't matter which transition we chose because they all eventually lead to Razor, though we did have to pick one of them to load it. And then after the approach was loaded, we had two choices. We could either delete all of the fixes on the transition we chose, which is what the pilot flying chose to do, or we could just use the cursor to jump over all of those fixes on the transition that we weren't going to be using, put the cursor on Razor, and then hit the direct 2 key. That's frankly what I probably would have done, as it would have been faster and taken less work. Plus, I don't really worry about extra waypoints that are further up on the flight plan that I'm essentially skipping over. But that's clearly a preference as to whether you as the pilot decide you want to delete unused waypoints in the flight plan or not. And it turns out in this particular case that the Razor 4 arrival is one of those arrivals that splits later after the common fix into two parts, one feeding each end of the parallel runways at San Jose. Initially, we had loaded the branch that leads to the runways 30 left and 30 right, but later on the arrival, ATC alerted us that we'd be landing on either 12 left or 12 right. So in the Garmin G3000 and the Vision Jet, there are two ways I know to make that change. One is to reload the entire arrival, which would be a lot of work, especially if we decided to delete all the waypoints again that we were able to skip over since we were cleared to Razor and not one of the transitions leading to Razor. And an easier way is to go into the MFD's home screen and choose the performance data icon and then change the landing runway to either 12 left or 12 right. By the way, when you first look at an arrival chart, you want to see if there are any crossing altitudes marked on it. Those are the ones that I mentioned that are blue on the JEP charts. On the FAA arrival charts, all of the altitudes are black, which makes it a little harder to figure out which altitudes are MEAs and which are crossing altitudes. Now, the way you tell is that MEAs are always next to the line segments that join two fixes together. And the crossing altitudes, if there are any on the chart, are always right next to the fixes, not between the fixes. By the way, if there are no crossing fixes, ATC cannot issue a clearance to descend via the arrival. Instead, ATC will assign every altitude for you to fly on that arrival. By contrast, if you see crossing altitudes next to one or more fixes, by the way, those crossing altitudes are usually directly above the fix or printed just below the fix. If you see those, ATC is permitted to issue a clearance that include the words descend via and the name of the arrival, which then requires you to descend to the crossing altitudes on your own. Now, there are 4 different ways a crossing altitude can be depicted, and it's important to know the symbology for these 4 altitude types so that you can fly the arrival correctly. To communicate the different crossing altitude types, horizontal lines are placed immediately above or below the crossing altitude. So if, for example, you see a crossing altitude like 10,000 feet and there are horizontal bars above and below that altitude, then this is a mandatory altitude and you must cross the fix at that altitude. You cannot be higher or lower when you come to that fix. And if there is a horizontal line under the crossing altitude, well, then this is a minimum altitude. So, for example, if it says 8,000 feet and there's a bar under the 8,000, you can cross at any altitude you'd like as long as it's at or above 8,000 feet. Likewise, if there's a horizontal line above the crossing altitude, then this is a maximum altitude. So, for example, if it says 6,000 feet and there's a bar above the 6,000, you can cross at any altitude you'd like as long as it's at or below 6,000 feet. And finally, you can have a combination of minimum and maximum altitudes, which essentially gives you a block of altitudes for crossing a particular fix. In that case, you'll see 2 crossing altitudes, one stacked on top of the other, and there will be a horizontal bar above the top altitude and another bar below the bottom altitude. So it kind of looks like an altitude sandwich with horizontal lines, if you think of those as the slices of bread with 2 altitudes between the bread slices. So, for example, if you were required to cross a fix between 6,000 and 4,000 feet, then you'll see a stack of lines and numbers that looks like this from top to bottom. Horizontal line with a 6,000 below it and a 4,000 below that with another horizontal line under the 4,000 number. So when you review an arrival, or departure for that matter, you want to look for crossing altitudes that you'll have to meet when you fly the arrival. Now, in addition to crossing altitudes, you need to look for any speed restrictions over any of the fixes on the arrival. And depending upon what speed your aircraft flies, you may find that the speed requirement is one item that prevents you from flying a particular arrival. And over the weekend in the Vision Jet, we came across 2 speed restrictions that we could not meet, and ATC handled those 2 situations in 2 different ways. While flying into Las Vegas in the Vision Jet, we were assigned an arrival with a mandatory speed of 250 knots at one of the fixes on the arrival. Well, when we notified ATC that we couldn't meet that restriction, they vectored us off of that arrival, and they assigned us a different arrival that took a slightly longer path, which didn't have any speed restrictions. And if you're wondering why a Vision Jet couldn't make a 250 knot speed restriction, well, it's because 250 knots is the maximum speed of that jet. Go above that and you're into the red and white barber pole warning on the airspeed indicator. And by the way, a good way to achieve that speed restriction in a descent is to use the FLC, or flight level change mode, on the autopilot if you have that mode. Now, that mode is also called IAS, for indicated airspeed mode, on the Cirrus Perspective SR-20s and SR-22s. And that mode allows you to climb or descend at a specified airspeed. So it's handy for meeting a speed restriction if you're climbing or descending across a fix. And by the way, if you're thinking, gee, 250 knots, isn't that slow for a jet? Let me remind you that the Cirrus Vision Jet is the only certified civilian jet in the world that has only one engine. So yes, of course, it's slower than all other jets, which have at least twice as many engines. But when you're cruising along at flight level 280 in a Vision Jet, you're also only burning about 60 gallons per hour, which is going to be less than any other jet in the skies. So as I learned in engineering school, there's a trade-off for everything. So yes, it's slower than other jets, but it's also cheaper to operate than other jets. When flying back into San Jose, we also had a 250 knot speed restriction on that arrival. And when we told ATC about it, they weren't concerned, and they actually left us on that arrival, presumably because there weren't any aircraft behind us on the same arrival. So there you have it. Lessons learned on flying arrival procedures in a Cirrus Vision jet. Some of the key takeaways for pilots should be: 1. Read the arrival charts ahead of time to find all crossing altitudes and speed restrictions. 2. Don't descend automatically on any arrival unless you've been issued a descend via clearance by ATC. 3. If you're not going to make a speed or altitude crossing restriction, notify ATC as soon as possible. 4. When loading an arrival into your GPS, be aware that you may have to load a transition even if you're not flying on that transition, but have been cleared directly to the fix for which the arrival procedure is named. And finally, number 5, use FLC or IAS mode on the autopilot to meet speed restrictions while descending. Well, there you have it. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback and questions, including some additional tips from Dan Bass. You may remember him. He's the Mooney pilot I interviewed last week who survived a crash with carbon monoxide poisoning. We'll be right back. And before I get to listener feedback and questions, I want to give you a quick update on a change I'm going to make to the show, and this is based on inputs received from the listener survey. So thanks to everybody who has been filling out our listener survey. A number of people commented that they really don't like hearing me mention the names of folks who have left reviews for us. And I'm going to go ahead and stop doing that in the future. But I wanted to thank everybody who has left reviews in the past. And I'm just going to go a final thank you to people who have left reviews, but I won't be doing that again in the future. Now, I want to let you know that reviews serve one purpose, which is really to establish credibility for the show. But what they don't do is help more people find the show. A lot of podcasters seem to think that, the more reviews I get, somehow that's going to push me up in the rankings and somehow more people are going to find my show. That is absolutely not true, according to all the podcast consultants that I listen to. So instead of asking you to leave reviews, I'm going to double down on asking you to encourage your friends to subscribe to the show. But let me quickly thank all the folks who have not mentioned who have left reviews. These were in the Apple Podcast app. Thanks to Garrett86, MyFitnessPA14VI, Jim Bob Tour, Nick X, and SDO587. And then people who have left reviews for me in the Apple App Store for the iOS app, they would include Viper Mock, E1M8 Love, Tiff Shiro, and KSFF Pilot. And thanks to people who have left reviews for our Android app. Those include Peter Alberti, Craig Lewis, and Bill. So going forward, instead of leaving a review, if you would, please tell your friends how to find the show. And now here's feedback from Jim. He's a medical examiner talking about episode 88.
Ironically, this morning in the Aviation Herald, a Spirit Airlines Airbus going to Las Vegas landed in Denver because of fumes, which turned out to be suspected carbon monoxide. So that's extremely interesting that the airlines are also having potential issues along those lines. As a medical examiner and a forensic pathologist and a rusty GA pilot, I have seen many variations on carbon monoxide poisoning leading to death. So keep up the good work, and you've got really a great podcast. Bye.
And Jim, thanks so much for that feedback. Here's an email from Kyle, who's one of our Patreon supporters. He says, I want to pass along some good news. I passed my instrument check ride last weekend. Thanks for all the great info on Aviation News Talk. I definitely directly applied much of what you discussed during the oral and the practical portion of the check ride. I'm now working on my commercial certificate. Well, congratulations, Kyle. That's fantastic. And here's an email from Trevor. He says, Max, I want to add to your comments about another way to open a VFR flight plan. If you file the flight plan with 1-800-WXBrief.com, there is an option to open and close your flight plan via text message. No data link required and no need to talk to anyone. And he says from the website, it says the Pilot Web Easy Activate and Easy Close, which are their trademark phrases, will now use a SMS provider for providing text messaging services. He says, I used the service last summer. It worked great at my destination. I didn't have a strong LTE connection on my cell phone, but I was able to send and receive text messages, and it's free. Well, that's totally cool. Here's an email from Vicky in Maryland on a related subject. She says, Max, in episode 88, You were talking about opening VFR flight plans. Just want to let you know that 1-800-WXBrief.com offers a predetermined departure option. This way your flight plan opens automatically at a time of your choosing. She says, I fly in the DC Special Flight Rules area where it can be awkward to leave the frequency to open a VFR flight plan in a timely manner. This helps me to not get distracted by other tasks and forget to open the plan. They also offer a reminder via text or email to close your flight plan. Well, there's a couple different great options, so check out 800-WXBrief.com. I've got to do that because I would like to have an easier way to open and close flight plans. And here's a text message from Moj Kazi, one of our Patreon supporters. He says that you can get GPS on a Wi-Fi iPad if you connect it to your phone's hotspot. Well, that's cool. I didn't realize that. So if you happen to have one of those Wi-Fi only iPads that don't have a built-in GPS, as I mentioned recently, as a listener kind of reminded me, one option is to buy an external GPS like the Bad Elf or the GPSs from the company named Dual. Another, according to Moj, just connect it to your phone's hotspot. Pretty cool. Now, here's an email from Don regarding episode 85. He says, love your Aviation News Talk podcast. I want to correct one answer you gave to the listener about MOAs. You said that military aircraft are not dogfighting in an MOA. Which is kind of funny. That doesn't sound like something I would have said. Let's go to question number 1, military operations area. Wikipedia says a military operations area is airspace established outside of Class A to separate or segregate certain non-hazardous military activities from IFR traffic and to identify for VFR traffic where these activities are conducted. Afraid not. Did not say military aircraft are not dogfighting in an MOA. I said that MOAs are for non-hazardous activities. Don continues, in fact, that is one of the main things fighters practice in an MOA. They may also do 2 versus 2 or even 4 versus 4 intercepts and advanced handling exercises. In all, the maneuvering can be a high speed with rapid changes in altitude, heading, and orientation. As a former military aviator, I would highly recommend civilian pilots remain clear of MOAs or at least contacting the controller agency to check the status before entering. Just realize that fighters don't carry tons of gas, so any termination of maneuvering costs training time and tax dollars. By the way, hazardous activity is in restricted airspace, but that means live munitions more than it refers to the type of maneuvers. Well, Don, I don't see that we disagreed on anything here, but thanks for the added clarification. And we had a number of comments following up on the 2 different episodes we've had on carbon monoxide. Chad from Arkansas writes, I have flown in so many different aircraft and I have been concerned about the factors that I am unaware of, like is there an exhaust leak? I often reflected on the paper carbon monoxide detectors that were affixed to the dash and wondered about their effectiveness and whether I would actually notice it if it changed color. He says, I was looking for an inexpensive solution. I decided to go to my local hardware store and pick up a home battery-powered carbon monoxide detector. It appears from the instructions that it's perhaps not quite as sensitive as the portable carbon monoxide detector that you had. It's good for 5 years. The 9-volt battery is replaced yearly. However, it is light and easily fits in the side pocket of my Cirrus. It fits within my budget at about $25. Well, Chad, I think you're right. It probably is not going to be as sensitive. I'm sorry we didn't talk about this in more detail in the first CO poisoning episode I had, but we did talk about it a little bit further in the interview that we had with Dan Bass last week. And according to an article that I've read and also discussions with Dan, he says that the home detectors are set to go off at a much higher level of carbon monoxide and that they have a built-in delay in sounding an alarm, whereas the industrial types update every few seconds. So I would certainly encourage you to get one of the industrial detectors, which is going to, by the way, give you the opportunity to detect low-level leaks and give you advance warning that maybe your exhaust system is starting to get a leak long before it's causing an actual problem. And here's an email from Paul in Illinois. He says, good job. Amazon is now out of stock on the CO detectors you recommended. I looked at them this morning, Friday, and by 2:30 Central Time, they were sold out. I think your podcast is making an impact. Thanks for all you do. Well, Paul, sorry about that. I listed 6 different detectors, and hopefully they'll be in stock quickly. Anybody who's interested in one, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/90. That's the numbers 90, and that'll take you to our webpage. And if you scroll down on the page, you'll see the different detectors listed. Now, here's an email from Dan Bass. He was the pilot we interviewed in episode 90 with a couple of follow-up things. He said, there are two things I completely forgot to mention that are huge takeaways. First is shoulder harnesses. My Mooney had them installed, but many of the legacy airplanes are still flying with just lap belts. There is no question the shoulder harness saved my life. I had a diagonal bruise across my chest that was there for nearly a month after the crash. If someone owns an airplane without shoulder harnesses, that should be the very next upgrade. The other big takeaway was being aware of where and how you're mounting a portable device in the cockpit. My iPad mini was mounted on the pilot yoke with a RAM mount. Good product, holds things right where you put them, but the iPad RAM mount is what ultimately broke my jaw and knocked my teeth out. So it's good to think about where everything is mounted, how it is mounted, and what might happen if there were a crash. I still use an iPad mounted on the yoke, but now use a magnetic mount so the iPad breaks free with very little effort. I don't know for certain that this is better, but it seems to make sense to me. Thanks so much for that follow-up, Dan. Good points. And now let's go to some listener questions. Here's an email from Dallas. That's his name. That's not where he's from. He says, I have a question regarding TRSAs. That's TRSAs. I remember hitting them briefly in my pilot training, but was never really taught about the proper procedures for flying into or through one. In this case, I'm asking specifically about the Scranton International TRSA. And I have to pick up an aircraft I'm purchasing there, but as I began to plan my trip, I quickly realized I am very unfamiliar with TRSA procedures. Is radio communication required outside the Class Delta airspace in the TRSA? Thanks so much for the time and effort you put into the podcast. Fly safe from Dallas. And I wrote back to Dallas and said there are only a handful of TRSAs left around the country. They are like a Class C in that they provide radar service for their main airport, but they are unlike a Class C in that you aren't required to talk to them as you pass through them. However, you are, of course, required to talk to the Class D airport near the center of the TRSA. So if you're flying in commercially and flying out in your new airplane, just talk to ground or clearance delivery if they have one to get your squawk code, departure frequency, and any initial headings or altitudes they give you. Then talk with ground to taxi to the runway, talk to the tower to take off, and then contact departure when tower switches you to them. It will be very easy. And I said if you're flying into Scranton via general aviation, just get flight following at some point along the way, and they'll eventually hand you off to the ATC people responsible for the TRSA. Even though you're not required to talk to them, it's a good idea to get flight following anytime you're in a TRSA. And I did hear a point recently on another podcast where a controller mentioned, in addition to everything I've said here, that it really helps them from a sequencing standpoint to fit you in with other traffic that's arriving at the tower if you're talking to the TRSA controllers first. If you just call up the tower, it's a little harder to try and fit you in. Anyway, Dallas, I hope you had a great trip and you're enjoying your new airplane. And here are a couple of questions regarding CFI rating, both of them from a gentleman named Luke, though different Lukes. Luke in Minnesota writes, Hi, Max. I'd like to ask your opinion on what you think I should do. I started flying at 15 years old back in 1966. I soloed at 16, got my private in a United States Air Force Aero Club at 19, and then used my military GI Bill to get my commercial instrument multi-engine and instructor rating. I let the instructor's rating lapse in 1982, and I've been flying on and off ever since. He says, now I'm 66 and retiring. I am wanting to go back to instructing. Would you recommend renewing the instructor's rating, or would it be easier to go back for my double I? I'm in excellent health and hold a second-class physical. What do you think? He says, by the way, love what you're doing with the podcast. It's inspiring to go back to teaching. I wrote back to Luke and I said, well, given the choice, I would definitely encourage you to get your CFII rating as a way to reinstate your CFI for a couple of reasons. I said, first, you're going to go through a lot of effort, whether you reinstate your CFI or you get a double I. So for the same effort, why not have 2 CFI ratings instead of 1? And second, I said, I think the CFII check ride is easier than the CFI check ride. The flying portion is similar to the instrument check ride, which is definitely easier than the CFI check ride. And I said, there's one major argument that goes against this recommendation. If you either, 1, don't like flying IFR, or 2, don't plan to spend much or any time teaching IFR, then you might prefer to reinstate your CFI instead of getting a double I. Hope that helps. And for Luke in Washington State, Luke says, hey, Max, I'm an initial CFI candidate and was doing some research into logging PIC time, and I came across a question that I can't seem to find an FAA-backed answer for. What are the requirements for logging time in an amphibious aircraft? As I take off from a hard surface and land at another land airport, can I log the time as SEL? That would be single-engine land. If I don't have an SES rating but received training in an amphibious aircraft during which time both land and water landings were performed, can I log PIC time for the time that I was the sole manipulator of the controls of an aircraft for which I was rated SEL? Says, I'm a huge fan, would love your thoughts. And Luke, great question. I agree. I have never seen any answers for these questions either, but I also know the FAA has very few rules about logging time. Now, I still own a Lake Amphibian, which is out of annual and I need to sell, and I've always logged all of the hours in the plane as SES or single engine seaplane, regardless of what type of surface I'm landing on. That makes sense to me, as all of the procedures are the same all the time, like remembering to lower the gear on a hard surface and not lowering it for a water landing. I'm not really sure it's worth trying to split the time for non-water landings. As a single-engine land pilot, if you weren't rated into seaplanes, I certainly believe that you could log as PIC all the time as you fly from one hard surface to another hard surface in the airplane. But I wouldn't log the time as PIC if it included water landings because you would not be rated for that. That's just my opinion, but you might want to ask other seaplane CFIs and see what they say. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on listener question so you can record it and I'll play it on the show, or just click on contact, send me an email. And some of these questions I just answer quickly over email. Some of them make it onto the show. Happy to help out anyone who has a question. And when you've got a moment, go out to our Patreon site. Consider becoming a supporter of the show. We had a couple supporters drop out so far this month for various reasons. So if you'd like to take one of their places, go to the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And all I can say is I hope everybody is enjoying the Christmas holidays. I'm certainly going to be doing a little bit of flying. I hope you are as well. And if you are starting to think about next year and you're thinking about maybe buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, contact me now over the holidays. I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus. Can also help you understand the various factors involved in buying new versus used. I specialize in the Cirrus, all of them, and work with people around the world. And finally, if you would do that one thing to help grow the show, and that is to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they're not familiar with what a podcast is, well, just grab a hold of their phone, take them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, and download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS or Android. To get the app, just go to the App Store, search for Aviation News Talk, and download the app. By the way, did I mention the apps are free? So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.